The sound is what I remember most. Not the soaring hymns in the basilica or the gentle murmur of Latin in morning mass. Not the rustle of silk vestments or the chime of the Sanctus bell. I remember the sound of a voice forcing its way through the keyhole of a locked door, a sound like stone grinding on stone, like the dry hiss of a serpent, a sound that proved to me that the devil was not in hell. He was in the Vatican and he was taking appointments. My name is not important. To give it would be a death sentence, and I have lived with one of those for long enough. What is important is where I worked, who I served, and what I saw in the dead of night when the tourists were gone and the prayers of the faithful had faded into silence. For 12 years, I was a lay valet in the papal apartments, a ghost in the holiest house on earth. My job was simple: to be invisible, to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to see nothing, and to hear less. We all took an oath, not written on paper, but impressed upon our souls. The secrets of the Holy Father are the secrets of God, and to betray them is to betray God himself. I believed it. We all did. The Pope I served was a paradox. In public, he was a beacon of warmth, his homilies filled with love and forgiveness. He spoke of a simple faith one a child could understand. But in private, when the heavy doors of his apartments were shut, the warmth was replaced by a chilling, academic intensity. His eyes, which twinkled for the cameras, would narrow in the lamplight of his study, scanning texts I was never allowed to get close enough to read. They weren't Bibles or theological treatises bound in familiar red morocco. They were massive tomes, bound in dark, unmarked leather, their pages filled with complex geometric patterns, star charts, and a script that was neither Latin nor Greek. He was a man possessed by a secret, and the weight of it bent his shoulders when he thought no one was watching. For my first year, my duties were mundane. I laid out his vestments, served his simple meals of broth and bread, and ensured his chambers were kept in perfect order. The Apostolic Palace is a city unto itself, a labyrinth of marble and gold, but the papal apartments are its forbidden, silent heart. After 10 p.m., a silence falls that is unlike any I have ever known. It is a heavy, ancient silence, thick with the whispers of centuries. It was in that silence that I first sensed something was profoundly wrong. There was one room at the end of a little-used corridor off his private study that was always locked. It wasn't a chapel or an office. It had no windows. The door was made of dark, heavy wood, reinforced with black iron bands, like a prison door. Unlike every other door in the palace, it had no crucifix. In its place was a small, seven-sided symbol carved deep into the wood. But why would a man of God need a room without God in it? My quiet life of service ended on a Tuesday. The Pope summoned me long after he had retired, close to midnight. He looked pale, and his usually steady hands trembled slightly. "The book on the lower shelf of my private study," he said, his voice barely a whisper, a dry rustle of parchment. "The one with the silver clasp. Bring it to me, and then wait outside the oratory of Saint Sebastian." It was a strange request. The oratory was a small, private chapel, rarely used, a place of quiet contemplation. But he didn't go to the chapel. I retrieved the heavy book, its leather cover cold to the touch, and watched as he carried it not toward the altar, but down the silent corridor, toward the iron-banded door. He produced a key from a chain around his neck, one that didn't hang with the others, one that was black and strangely shaped. He unlocked the door. He slipped inside without a backward glance, and the lock clicked shut with a sound of finality, leaving me alone in the oppressive darkness. An hour passed, then two. The only sound was the faint hum of the palace's ancient electrical system, a sound like a distant, sleeping beast. I started to worry, to wonder if I should fetch the captain of the Swiss Guard. But my orders were to wait. And then I heard it, a sound that stripped the faith from my soul. It was the Pope's voice, but not as I knew it. He was chanting, a low, guttural rhythm that vibrated through the floor. The language was harsh, filled with sharp consonants and long, drawn-out vowels that seemed to stretch and tear the very fabric of the holy silence. It was a language built to command, not to plead. And beneath the primal fear that froze my blood, I understood the most terrible truth of all. He wasn't praying. He was commanding. Faith, I have learned, is a warm, well-lit room. It has sturdy walls, a solid door, and you believe with all your heart that nothing can get in. That night, standing in the cold, dark corridor of the Apostolic Palace, that door was thrown open to a blizzard, and I have been cold ever since. Every instinct, every nerve, every fiber of my being that screamed of survival told me to run. My duty was to the Pope, but my life belonged to God, and I was certain that whatever was happening on the other side of that door was a blasphemy that God had long since abandoned. I should have fled. I should have found the Swiss Guard, their halberds and polished armor a comforting, solid presence against the night. I should have hammered on the door of the master of pontifical ceremonies and confessed the horror I was hearing. But the oath held me fast. It was a chain around my soul, and its links were forged of piety and fear. I was a servant of the Holy Father, and his will was my law, even if it led us both into damnation. So I stood my ground, my back pressed against the cold marble wall, and I listened. The Pope's chanting grew in intensity, the alien syllables forming a rhythm that was both hypnotic and repulsive. It was a sound that felt designed to peel back the layers of reality, to pry open a seam in the world. And the world was responding. The air in the corridor grew colder still. Not a draft, but a deep, penetrating chill that had nothing to do with the night. It felt ancient, like the cold of a tomb that had not seen light in millennia. The flame of the single votive candle at the far end of the hall, which had burned steadily for hours, began to flicker violently, spitting and hissing as if fighting against an unseen wind. It cast dancing, distorted shadows that seemed to writhe on the walls, turning the serene paintings of saints into leering gargoyles. I could feel a pressure building in my ears, a low thrum that vibrated up through the soles of my shoes from the very stones of the palace. The silence between the Pope's chants was the worst part. It was a listening silence. Pregnant, terrible pause, waiting for a response. And then the response came. It was not a human voice. It was a dry, rasping whisper that seemed to come from the door itself, from the cracks in the ancient wood, from the very air in front of me. It sounded like 1,000 dried leaves skittering across pavement, like sand scouring bone. It was a voice devoid of moisture, of life, of anything I could recognize as good or holy. It spoke in the same alien language as the Pope, but where his tone was one of iron-willed command, this voice was laced with an ancient amusement, with a deep and profound contempt that had festered for eons in the dark. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I thought they would break. I wanted to cover my ears, but I was paralyzed by a terror so complete it was almost a religious experience. This was not a conversation. It was a summons. The Pope was speaking to something, and that something was answering. The exchange lasted for what felt like an eternity but was likely only minutes. The whispering voice would grow in volume, pressing against the door with palpable force, and the Pope would answer with a sharp, commanding phrase, like a lion tamer cracking a whip at a beast he could barely control. I heard a sound like claws scraping on stone, a low growl that vibrated through the floor and up my spine. The candle at the end of the hall extinguished with a final, desperate pop, plunging me into absolute, terrifying darkness. In that moment, I was certain the door would burst open, that whatever was inside would spill out into the sacred halls of the Vatican. I squeezed my eyes shut and began to pray the rosary in my mind, the familiar words a flimsy, childish shield against the primal horror in the next room. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The cold dissipated. The pressure in my ears vanished. The only thing left was a silence more profound and empty than before. A few minutes later, the heavy door creaked open. The Pope emerged, a hunched silhouette in the faint moonlight from a distant window. His face was ashen and slick with sweat. His robes were disheveled, and there was a long, thin, impossibly straight scratch on his cheek that hadn't been there before, red and angry against his pale skin. He looked right through me, his eyes vacant, haunted, as if he just gazed into the heart of the sun and found only darkness. He clutched the book to his chest and shuffled past me without a word, heading back to his apartments. He didn't lock the door behind him. For a single, insane moment, I thought about looking inside. A part of me needed to see. But the fear was greater than my curiosity. I turned and fled, my footsteps echoing in the cavernous silence. I knew then that the Vatican's greatest secrets weren't in its archives or its bank. They were locked in rooms like that one, and they were still alive. In the Vatican, trust is not a comfort. It is a leash. After the night of the whispers, the Pope put that leash around my neck, and it has been tightening ever since. He had seen that I had not broken, that I had held my post in the face of a terror that should have shattered my sanity. I had not spoken. I had not fled. I had passed some unspoken, unholy test, and in doing so, I had stepped across a threshold from which there was no return. My mundane duties became a cover for my true purpose. I was no longer just a valet. I was a secret acolyte, a silent accomplice in a ritual I didn't understand. The Pope began to trust me with tasks that chilled me to the bone. He would send me to the deepest, most restricted levels of the Vatican's secret archives, to places far beyond where even cardinals were permitted to go. Deeper than the archives of the Inquisition, further down than the vaults that hold the personal letters of fallen kings. I was given a key, a specific route to follow through damp, cold corridors that smelled of old paper and ozone, and a catalog number that didn't exist on any public index. My instructions were always the same, whispered in the gloom of his study. Bring me the item marked with this sigil. Speak to no one. Let no one see you. And never, ever, look directly at it if you can help it. The objects were always stored in heavy, lead-lined boxes, sealed not with a crucifix but with the same seven-sided symbol that was carved on the ritual room door. These were not the relics of saints. They were not splinters of the true cross or vials of holy water. They were instruments, and they felt profane to the touch. The first item I retrieved was a mirror. It was not made of glass, but a perfect circle of polished black obsidian. So cold it felt like it was stealing the heat from my hands, and so dark it seemed to drink the light from the room. It was heavy, and as I carried it, I had the distinct and horrifying sensation that something was watching me from within its black, depthless heart. Another time he sent me for a scroll. It was not papyrus, but a thin, flexible sheet of what looked like hammered copper, etched with the same angular, alien script from the Pope's book. The scroll felt warm, almost alive, and when my fingers accidentally brushed against the inscription, a jolt of static electricity shot up my arm. For a split second, an image flashed in my mind, vivid and complete. A sky filled with two suns over a city of impossible geometry. I saw towers that twisted into the heavens, built from a material that was not stone or metal, but solidified darkness. I dropped the box and stumbled back against the stone shelf, my heart racing, a scream trapped in my throat. I had violated the rule. I had looked. I became obsessed. A quiet, gnawing madness took root in my soul. During my rare time off, I would go to the public libraries of Rome, a ghost haunting the Egyptology section. I sketched from memory the sigils I saw on the boxes, the angular script from the scroll. And then I found it, a small detail I had overlooked, etched near the clasp of the copper scroll. It was the stylized head of an ibis, the sacred bird of Thoth, the Egyptian god of writing, magic, and hidden knowledge. The god the early church fathers had labeled a demon, a trickster, a servant of Satan. It was then that the pieces began to fall into place, forming a mosaic of such profound heresy that it threatened to tear my mind apart. The language the Pope spoke was not the tongue of hell. It was the language of the temples. The symbols were not satanic. They were hieratic. The being he was communing with, the source of the whispers and the scratching, was not a demon from the Christian hell. It was something else, something older. The Church had not cast these beings into a lake of fire. It had buried them, renamed them, silenced their followers, and then, in the deepest secrecy, behind locked doors and under vows of silence, it had continued to seek their knowledge. My terror was no longer of damnation, of fire and brimstone. It was the cold, intellectual fear of a forbidden equation. The Pope wasn't performing an exorcism. He was conducting a consultation. These weren't demons. They were librarians, ancient, terrifying, and possessing a collection that predated humanity. And the Vatican, the holy seat of the Catholic Church, was their private reading room. A new, more terrifying question began to haunt my waking thoughts and my sleepless nights. What terrible question could be worth such a risk? What knowledge was so vital that the Vicar of Christ himself would consult the very beings he called demons to find the answer? There are truths so heavy they can break a single soul. One night, in the suffocating silence of his private study, the Pope chose to share the weight of that truth with me, and I have felt my own soul cracking ever since. He found me in the palace library, staring at a plate in a book about Egyptian funerary texts, my mind still reeling from the image of the twin sons. He didn't look angry. He just looked tired, ancient, like a mountain worn down by millennia of wind and rain. He placed a hand on my shoulder, his touch surprisingly frail. "Curiosity is a dangerous virtue," he said softly. "It is the one God gave to man that most resembles his own." He led me back to his study, a place I had only ever been to clean, a room that smelled of old leather, beeswax, and a faint, lingering trace of ozone. He poured 2 small glasses of brandy, the amber liquid catching the lamplight like trapped fire. He looked at me, his eyes searching for something: disloyalty, fear, perhaps just a flicker of understanding. "You have heard things," he stated. It was not a question. "You have carried objects of immense power, and you have not spoken. You have earned a sliver of the truth." He told me a story that shattered my perception of faith, of the world, of God himself. The Catholic Church, he explained, was more than a spiritual body. It was a shield, a containment protocol, a warden. For 2,000 years it had been fighting a silent, secret war, not against other religions or the march of secularism, but against knowledge itself. Specifically, against truths that humanity was not ready for, and against forces that it could not, and must not, ever comprehend. "We did not invent God," the Pope said, his voice low and intense, the warmth of the brandy doing nothing to chase the chill from his words. "We inherited the systems used to contain and communicate with the powers that this world calls gods. We gave them new names: angels, demons, saints, to make them manageable, to fit them into a narrative that could guide humanity without breaking its fragile mind. But the old names, the true names, still have power. The rituals," he explained, "were not satanic. They were a continuation of a terrible, necessary duty that stretched back to the priests of Ra and the mystics of Babylon. They were a form of cosmic negotiation, a way of keeping ancient, non-human intelligences, the entities we call demons, bound by pacts forged before the birth of Christ. These beings were not evil in the way we understood it. They were forces of pure chaos, amoral and vast, like a black hole or a supernova. Their existence, if truly known, would annihilate the human concept of meaning. And the Church, through ritual and the focused power of global prayer, maintained the fragile order of reality. "We hold the keys," he said, "and part of that duty is to occasionally speak to the prisoners, to rattle their cages, to ensure the locks are still holding." He rose from his chair and walked to a heavy, iron-bound chest. From it, he unrolled a map across his desk. It was made of vellum so old it was nearly translucent, and it was covered in symbols I recognized from the artifacts. It was not a map of countries, but a map of power. Lines of shimmering energy, which he called Via Dei, God's roads, crisscrossed the globe. At the intersection of these lines were points of immense power, glowing faintly on the ancient parchment. He pointed to Jerusalem, to Stonehenge, to the Great Pyramid of Giza. "Every sacred site is a lock," he whispered. "Our cathedrals were built on top of pagan temples for a reason. Not to conquer them, but to reinforce the seals." Then, his finger trembled as he tapped a location that made my blood run cold. The base of the massive Egyptian obelisk that stands in the center of St. Peter's Square. "That was not brought here as a trophy," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "It is an antenna, and a cork. It holds something in place. Something that has been sleeping for a very, very long time. My rituals are to ensure it remains that way." I looked from the impossible map to the quiet, elderly man I served. He was not just the vicar of Christ. He was a jailer, and his prison was the entire world. He saw the horror in my face. "It is a terrible burden," he sighed. "But it is our burden. And now it is also yours to know." He looked away, toward the darkened window. "The stars are coming into a configuration not seen in 7 centuries. A celestial key is turning. One of the main locks is weakening. That is why I must speak to a power we have not consulted since the Dark Ages. A power that offers knowledge, but at a terrible price." He was preparing me. He was telling me all this because he knew the next ritual was different, and he was afraid he would not survive it. There are moments that act as a fulcrum for a life, where everything that came before is simply the before, and everything that follows is the after. For me, that moment was the night the Pope tried to ask a question of a God he had taught the world to forget. It was the night the lock on a very old door was not merely rattled, but broken, and I was in the room when it happened. The day of the ritual was marked by a palpable tension that settled over the apostolic palace like a shroud of fine, gray ash. The Pope had been fasting for 3 days, subsisting only on blessed water. His staff were told he was in a period of intense prayer for the soul of the world and was not to be disturbed. I knew the truth. He was purifying his body, making it a suitable vessel to withstand the psychic storm he was about to invite. He was preparing for a summons far more dangerous than any before. He believed my presence, my simple, untainted faith, would act as an anchor for his soul. Looking back, I believe I was meant to be the sacrifice if the anchor failed. When I entered the windowless room that evening, it was transformed. The air was thick and heavy, shimmering with the smoke from burning herbs I did not recognize. Something metallic and sweet, like blood and honey. The obsidian mirror stood on a heavy iron tripod in the center of the room. The copper scroll was unrolled before it, its strange script seeming to writhe in the candlelight. On the floor, the Pope had drawn a complex circle of interlocking symbols, not in chalk, but in a fine white powder he told me was crushed bone. He handed me a heavy silver censer. "Keep this burning no matter what," he ordered, his voice thin and strained. "And do not, under any circumstances, look into the mirror. Your mind is not prepared for it. Gaze upon the flame and pray." He stood in the center of the circle and began the chant. It was the same horrible, ancient language, but this time it was quieter, more intricate. A complex series of phonetic keys whispered into the oppressive silence. It was less of a command and more of an invitation. For a long time, nothing happened. Then, the flame in my censer, which had been burning a steady orange, sputtered and flared into a cold, brilliant blue. The air grew frigid, a damp, sepulchral cold that clung to my clothes. A low hum filled the room, a sound that felt like it was coming from inside my own skull, vibrating behind my eyes. Then the mirror changed. The surface of the obsidian began to ripple, not like a reflection, but like a pool of black water. A profound darkness emanated from it, a void that seemed to suck all warmth and sound from the room. I obeyed the Pope's order. I stared at the blue flame in my hands, my knuckles white, but I could feel the scribe's arrival. The Pope fell silent. A new voice filled the room. It did not speak through the air, but bloomed directly inside our minds. A silent, screaming torrent of images, of information, of raw, unfiltered truth. I saw galaxies being born and dying in an instant. I saw the Earth from above, its lines of power glowing like a living, golden nervous system. I saw the faces of popes long dead, their eyes wide with the same terror I felt now. And I saw a city of black glass under a dying star, and I knew, with a certainty that was not my own, that this was where humanity had been born. I risked a glance at the Pope. His face was a mask of agony and ecstasy. His eyes were wide open, staring into the mirror, and they were glowing with a faint, silver light. He was receiving the knowledge he sought. But then, his expression shifted to one of pure, unadulterated terror. "No!" he screamed, not with his voice, but in my mind, a psychic shriek that threw me back against the wall. "It is a lie. The beginning. The beginning is not what we were told. The connection shattered. The hum ceased. The mirror went still, just a piece of polished black stone once more. And in the sudden, deafening silence, the Pope collapsed, a heap of white robes on the floor. The ritual was broken. I scrambled to his side, my own mind reeling from the psychic backlash. And then I saw it. Lying on the floor, in the very center of the broken bone dust circle, was a single, impossibly black feather. It was not from any bird I knew. It did not reflect the light. It consumed it, a tiny patch of absolute void. My hand trembled as I reached for it, this impossible artifact from an impossible place. As my fingers brushed its edge, a voice whispered in my head. It was not the scribe's voice. It was something else, something that had slipped through the open door in the chaos. A voice of pure malice and triumphant glee. And it said, "The lock is broken." There is a silence that follows a scream. And then there is the silence that follows a truth so profound it erases all sound forever. We lived in that second silence for a week, the Pope and I, two ghosts haunting the gilded tomb of the papal apartments. The ritual was over, but its consequences echoed in every empty corridor, in every flicker of a candle. The Pope never fully recovered. He aged a decade in that single night. The light in his eyes was gone, replaced by a permanent, haunted shadow that flinched at sudden movements. He spent his days staring out the armored window of his study, sometimes whispering names I didn't recognize. Names that were not of saints, but of stars and dead cities. He never entered the ritual room again. The door was locked, this time with a new, heavy iron bar, and the key was given to the commander of the Swiss Guard with instructions that it was only to be opened upon the Pope's death, at which point the entire chamber was to be filled with consecrated cement. The artifacts were returned to the archives, but I know the seal on their lead boxes was different. A second, more complex sigil was added. Some things, once known, cannot be unknown. A week after the incident, he summoned me. His voice, once a powerful instrument of faith, was now a dry rustle. He was holding a small silver box. Inside, I knew, was the black feather. "What you saw," he said, not looking at me but at the box, "was not meant for human eyes. The scribe showed me a truth about the origin of our faith, a truth so terrible that it would shatter the world. We are not who we think we are." He finally met my gaze, and his eyes were bottomless pools of despair. "We are not the inheritors. We are the usurpers." He clutched my arm, his grip surprisingly strong, his fingers cold as iron. "This knowledge is a prison, my son. It is a curse. It will eat your soul from the inside out until there is nothing left but a screaming void. You must forget. For the good of your soul, you must forget what you saw, what you heard. Let it be a nightmare. Nothing more." But I couldn't forget. I couldn't unsee the city of black glass or unhear the voice that whispered that the lock was broken. And as I looked at the broken man before me, I knew that his warning was not a threat, but a plea. He was a jailer who had just learned he was guarding the wrong prison. And in his eyes, I saw my own future. To stay was to risk becoming like him, a warden in a prison of secrets, slowly losing my mind to the things I was supposed to be guarding. Or worse, I was a loose end, a witness to the moment the king saw he was naked. How long before the institution, the vast and ancient machinery of the church, decided to protect itself by erasing the witness. My fear of the supernatural was replaced by a much colder, more immediate terror. The fear of men who believe they are doing God's work. I knew my time in the Vatican was over. My escape was not dramatic. It was quiet, pathetic. One night, while the palace slept its heavy, dreaming sleep, I simply walked out. I packed a small bag with a change of clothes, all the money I had, and two other things. My secret journal, where I had meticulously documented every ritual, every artifact, every whispered word I could remember, and a charcoal rubbing I had made of the sigils from the copper scroll. It was my only proof, a flimsy shield against the most powerful institution on earth. As I walked through the silent courtyards, I felt the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes on my back, the gaze of the statues, the saints, the gargoyles. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. I didn't look back. I took a series of trains, heading north, crossing borders in the dead of night, always looking over my shoulder. I am a man without a name, without a home, haunted by what I know. I am telling this story now because the world is changing. People are looking for answers in old places. They are rediscovering the old names and the old ways. And I fear what happens when the locks they've maintained for 2 millennia finally break. They are not guarding us from hell. They are guarding their own power. And the truth they are hiding is not that demons are real. It is that the gods are real and they are waking up.